Hello again, it's Professor Hasselman, History 105, and this is the second part of our discussion on industrialization in Europe during this Industrial Revolution. So, this revolution had many repercussions for national economies and for people. The implications for national economies were far reaching. Before 1815, industrialization was very much a British phenomenon. Britain became even wealthier, and this meant this wealth built at the great British cities of North and the Midlands, such as Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, and Bradford. Industrialization linked the cities to each other and to the rest of Britain with railways. Now, this made possible the easier shipment of raw materials, goods, and people also. Finally, it fostered communications such as the penny post. Now, manufacturing wealth linked Britain to the rest of the world with steamships, and the sheer statistical data on the British Industrial Revolution were staggering. Between 1782 and 1852, industrial production grew 3 to 4% a year. Phenomenal at that time. By 1830, Britain produced 70% of the world's coal and 50% of the world's iron and cotton cloth. By 1850, per capita income was 32.6 pounds per annum in Britain, 21.1 per annum in France, which had been experiencing industrialization since Napoleon, and 13.3 per annum in Central Europe, thus just beginning to industrialize. By the 1870s, Britain produced 50% of the world's steel and owned 1/3 of the world's shipping and 1/2 of the world's railways. Now, though the British population also doubled from 1800 to 1850, per capita income rose 85%. Now, Britain became the world's supplier of cottons, woolens, cutlery, pots, pans, stoves, grates, railway engines, and steamships. And Britain's leadership role was put on display at the first World's Fair, the Crystal Palace exhibition of 1851. Now, perhaps the greatest marvel of all was the vast iron and glass building designed by Sir Joseph Paxton and built in prefabricated units to house it all, the Crystal Palace. And yet, the Crystal Palace stood just a few miles away from some of the worst slums in Europe. Now, the human implications of industrializations varied considerably depending on the class or group to which one belonged. Now, in the short term, the Industrial Revolution would seem to have had little impact on the landed aristocracy. The wealthiest and smartest aristocrats exploited their mineral and forest rights and invested in factories and railway and steamship lines. Thus, many aristocratic families grew wealthier. In the long run, though, the aristocracy was infiltrated and challenged by a new, more powerful middle class. Now, the old middling orders split in the 19th century as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The upper middling orders, great merchants and professionals with money to invest, new factory owners, or those otherwise able to service and profit from a growing economy, became wealthy, sometimes fabulously so. For example, the Wedgwood China dynasty, or the Vickers arms manufacturers and Cadbury's chocolate in Britain, the Rothschild banking family in France, Krupp's armaments in Germany, and Astor Land and Banking, Vanderbilt Railroads, and Morgan Banking in the United States. Now, many people were able to make enough from the family firm to buy their way into the aristocracy. And throughout Western Europe, this new wealthy middle class would increasingly demand political power. Now, the lower middling orders, those unable to invest in the new factory system, such as shopkeepers, craftsmen, and artisans, were unable to compete with it. Almost no one who had made goods by hand could compete with the cheap mass-produced goods created in factories. And these people, cobblers, tailors, ironworkers, and others, fell out of the middle class. Apprenticeships died out because there was no longer any need for skilled workers. and seeking factory work at sometimes starvation wages, these once skilled workers joined the immigrants from the countryside, falling into an entirely new class, the working class. Now, the working class, that is, urban factory workers, it was entirely a creation of the Industrial Revolution. As in the farm, all members of the family worked as soon as they could do so, certainly by the age of 6. Wages were often poor because of the huge labor market, and if you did not like the wages, then you could be replaced. Work itself was strictly regimented, repetitive, and quota-driven. Workers put in 12 to 16 hours a day, winter and summer, 6 days a week, 7 if behind on a quota. Working conditions were often dark, noisy, and dangerous. Now, given the laissez-faire economic policies that had made all this possible, there was no one to tell factory owners that this was no way to treat workers. Beginning in the 19th century, some members of the British Parliament began to inquire into the conditions of workers in the factories. The most famous of these was undertaken by the Sadler Commission on Child Labor during 1832. The Sadler Commission's findings were published in parliamentary papers from 1831 to 1832. Now, living conditions were not much better at the end of the day. Industrial towns grew too fast to plan for the arrival of hundreds of thousands of immigrants. Tenements were hastily thrown up to house these new arrivals. Tenements were essentially row houses. They had no indoor plumbing or toilets and often no windows. The air was thick with factory smoke and terrible smells from tanneries, dye workers, animal and human excrement, and assorted river smells. They were terribly overcrowded, whole families, sometimes extended families, living in a single room. Now, the working class diet consisted of potatoes, weak stew, stimulants such as tea, and depressants such as alcohol. Now, it's not surprising that the people in this class were especially prone to diseases, including typhus, cholera, diphtheria, malaria, and even smallpox. In 1840, the average death rate in Britain was 1 death in 45 per year, but in Manchester it was 1 in 20. Contemporary writers worried not just about the physical implications of all this, but the spiritual and moral effect of the industrial generations. In Britain, the government-sponsored poor law that was passed was supposed to be administered at the parish level, which didn't work very well when there was in fact no parish. And the new industrial economy promoted a fluid labor market in which boom and bust cycles caused people to move around the country constantly and broke up families. Now, close living conditions made privacy impossible and promoted not only disease, but abuse, domestic violence, and sexual promiscuity. It had been estimated that 1/2 of the babies born in European cities between 1830 and 1850 were illegitimate. So, who benefited from the Industrial Revolution? Now, an optimist would point to the general increase in national wealth, Britain's domination of world industry, trade, and finance, and the tremendous growth in productivity and the rise in per capita prosperity. A pessimist, on the other hand, would put against this the misery of the working class, the job insecurity from recurrent boom and bust cycles, and the poor working and living conditions already discussed. Now, the optimist might point out in reply, the farm had not been a worker's paradise either. Even if it had been, the agricultural revolution meant that as far as farm labor grew more efficient, fewer farm laborers were needed. These people would have had to go somewhere. It might be argued that it was a good thing that the factory system was there to absorb them. These would have been hard times on people anyway, thanks to the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars and bad harvests. Life in the city was at least exciting, and this led to a working class culture and sense of identity. The next step would be for workers to organize to fight for better pay and conditions, an option not open to their country counterparts because they were so spread out. Moreover, the concentration of workers in cities meant that they and their plight could not be ignored, if only because they threatened to overwhelm all the progress that European civilization had made up to this point.